Is that a wolf? Dr. Emily Carter froze in place, rain dripping from her soaked jacket as she squinted at the small, trembling figure curled up against the dumpster behind her clinic. She had seen abandoned puppies before, far too many in fact, but something about this one sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She crouched slowly, careful not to startle the little creature. It was tiny, much smaller than any wolf pup she had ever seen, but its features were unmistakably different from any domestic dog she had encountered. Its ears were a little too pointed, its fur thick and silver with darker streaks running down its back, and its golden eyes stared up at her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. Emily reached out, her gloved hand barely brushing the damp fur before the pup let out a soft whimper. Its whole body trembled, whether from fear, exhaustion, or both. She couldn't tell. The rain poured relentlessly, forming small rivers along the pavement, and she knew the poor thing wouldn't last much longer if she didn't do something quickly. She pulled off her jacket, wrapping it gently around the little body before cradling it close to her chest. The pup barely resisted, too weak to fight, and nestled against her warmth with a small sigh. "Come on, sweetheart," she murmured. "Let's get you out of this rain." Inside the clinic, the warmth was immediate, and Emily wasted no time setting up a heated blanket on the examination table. As she carefully unwrapped the jacket, she took in more details. The pup's paws were slightly oversized for its body, and its tiny nose twitched as it took in its surroundings. Its breathing was shallow, but steady. She grabbed a towel and started drying the damp fur, speaking softly. "You're going to be okay. Just need to warm you up a bit." As she worked, her assistant, Mark, stepped into the room, shaking out his umbrella. "You're not going to believe the traffic out there. It's like every driver forgot how to—" He stopped mid-sentence, eyes widening at the sight of the small bundle on the table. Where did you find that?" Emily glanced up. "Out back, shivering in the rain, probably abandoned?" Mark took a cautious step forward. "That doesn't look like any puppy I've seen before." Emily exhaled. "I know." Mark studied the pup, then looked at Emily. "Think it's a coyote?" She shook her head. "Too small, and look at the fur pattern." Mark rubbed his chin. "What are you thinking?" Emily hesitated. "I don't know yet, but I have a feeling this little one is special." The pup let out a tiny yawn, its ears twitching as it nestled deeper into the blanket. Emily reached out, gently stroking its damp fur, feeling the slow rise and fall of its chest. "Whatever you are," she whispered, "you're safe now." As the storm raged outside, Emily focused on stabilizing the pup. She checked for any visible injuries, feeling for fractures or signs of malnutrition. Its ribs were slightly prominent, but other than that, there didn't seem to be any immediate concerns beyond exhaustion and cold exposure. Mark crossed his arms. "We should call wildlife services. If it's not a dog—" "I know," Emily interrupted, "but I want to make sure it's stable first." Mark sighed, but nodded. "Fair enough." The pup stirred slightly, one tiny paw stretching out before curling back in. Emily felt something tighten in her chest. She had cared for hundreds of animals over the years, but something about this little creature felt different. It wasn't just the way it looked. It was the way it made her feel, like it had appeared in her life for a reason. She shook off the thought and turned to Mark. "Can you grab some formula? We'll try feeding it soon." As Mark disappeared into the supply room, Emily sat down beside the table, watching the pup. The storm outside raged on, but inside there was warmth, safety, and the beginning of something she couldn't quite explain. She had no idea that the tiny creature curled up on her table would change her life forever. Emily woke to the sound of soft whimpers. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, tapping gently against the windows of her small clinic. But the pup on the exam table was stirring, its tiny body shifting under the warm blankets she had wrapped it in the night before. She rubbed her tired eyes and stretched, rolling her shoulders as she stood and crossed the room. The little one was blinking up at her now, its golden eyes glassy but alert. "Good morning, sweetheart," she murmured, reaching out to stroke the damp fur. The pup flinched at first, then relaxed into her touch. "You gave me a scare last night." Mark entered the room, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He raised an eyebrow at Emily's tired expression. "You stayed here all night?" Emily nodded. "Couldn't leave the little one alone. Still haven't figured out what exactly we're dealing with." Mark took a long sip of his coffee, then set it down on the counter. "So, what's the plan? Call Wildlife Services?" Emily exhaled slowly. "I don't know. Something about this pup feels different." She shook her head, almost as if shaking away a thought she didn't want to entertain. "Let's just focus on getting it stronger first. Then we'll figure out what to do next." Mark watched her for a moment, but didn't argue. Instead, he grabbed a can of puppy formula from the cabinet. "Think it'll take a bottle? Only one way to find out?" Emily prepared the formula, carefully measuring the warm milk replacement into a small bottle. She lifted the pup gently, cradling it in one hand while she brought the bottle to its tiny snout. For a moment, the pup sniffed at it, uncertain, but then its mouth latched onto the rubber nipple, drinking hungrily. Emily smiled. "That's a good sign." Mark nodded. "At least we know it's got an appetite." They watched as the pup continued to drink, its small body finally relaxing into Emily's hands. When it had its fill, it let out a tiny sigh, curling up once more against the warmth of the blanket. "So, we keep it here for now?" Mark asked. Emily nodded. "Until we know what we're dealing with." "But," she hesitated, "I need to run some tests." Mark frowned. "Tests? I want to check its genetics. If it's part wolf or coyote, we need to know." Mark sighed, but didn't argue. "I'll get the kit." They worked in silence, carefully swabbing the inside of the pup's mouth to collect a DNA sample. Emily labeled the vial, sealing it for transport to the lab. It would take a few days for results, but at least they'd have a clearer picture soon. As she set the vial aside, the pup let out a soft yawn, stretching out one tiny paw. Something about the way it moved, almost too graceful, too aware for such a young creature, sent a strange feeling through her. "You're a mystery," she whispered. Mark chuckled. "You're getting attached." Emily shot him a look, but didn't deny it. The morning passed in a blur of routine tasks. Appointments came and went, owners bringing in their pets for checkups, vaccinations, and minor ailments. Emily kept an eye on the pup between visits, checking its vitals, making sure it stayed warm and comfortable. By midday, the rain had finally stopped, and a sliver of sunlight filtered through the windows. Mark sat at his desk, scrolling through his phone. "You know," he said, "I did a little research." Emily looked up from her notes. "On what?" Mark turned his phone toward her. "There have been reports of strange animal sightings in the area. People think they're wolves, but no one's sure." Emily frowned, taking the phone from him. The article he pulled up detailed several encounters, people spotting creatures with glowing eyes in the woods, hearing howls that didn't quite sound like wolves or coyotes. "Could be unrelated," Mark said. "Or it could be." He nodded toward the pup. Emily exhaled. "Let's not jump to conclusions." Still, as she glanced back at the small creature curled up in the blankets, She couldn't shake the feeling that Mark might be onto something. That night, Emily stayed at the clinic again. She had promised herself she wouldn't, but she couldn't bring herself to leave the pup alone. She pulled out a sleeping bag, setting it up on the floor beside the exam table. As she settled in, she watched the pup's tiny chest rise and fall. It was sleeping soundly now, its body no longer trembling, its fur drying into soft silver waves. Emily closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her. Just as she started to drift off, a small sound made her freeze. A whimper. But it wasn't just a whimper. It was a voice, almost. Emily's eyes snapped open. She sat up, staring at the pup. It was still curled up, but its mouth moved slightly, as if trying to form a sound beyond instinctual cries. Emily's heart pounded. Had she imagined it? She leaned in closer, watching, waiting. And then, in the smallest, faintest whisper, so soft she thought she might be dreaming, the pup made a sound that sent a shiver down her spine. A sound that almost sounded like a word. Home. Emily sat frozen in the dim glow of the clinic's emergency light, her breath caught in her throat. The tiny pup remained curled up, its body rising and falling steadily with sleep. But the whisper, if she had even heard it, echoed in her mind. She shook her head, rubbing her eyes. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on her. She had spent 2 nights at the clinic, running on little more than adrenaline and caffeine, and it wouldn't be the first time she imagined something out of sheer fatigue. Still, she couldn't bring herself to look away from the pup. Its fur had dried completely now, revealing the full extent of its silver sheen. It was unlike anything she had seen before, neither fully wild nor fully domestic. The mystery gnawed at her, deepening the unease that had settled in her chest. Home. The word replayed in her mind, softer now, almost absurd. Mark's voice cut through her thoughts. "You're still here?" Emily flinched, startled, then exhaled, willing her nerves to settle. She looked up to see him leaning against the doorframe, a takeaway cup of coffee in his hand. He raised an eyebrow as he stepped inside, his gaze shifting between her and the pup. "Yeah," she admitted. "Didn't feel right leaving." Mark set the coffee down in front of her. "You look like you need this." Emily took the cup gratefully, letting the warmth seep into her hands. She didn't drink it immediately. "Something weird happened," she said after a moment. Mark frowned. "Weird how?" She hesitated, feeling ridiculous even saying it out loud. "I swear I heard the pup make a noise, but it wasn't a whimper or a bark. It sounded like a word." Mark didn't laugh or scoff like she half expected. Instead, he studied the pup, silent for a moment. "You're sure?" "No," she admitted. "It could have been in my head." Mark crossed his arms. "You're not the type to imagine things." Emily let out a soft chuckle. "That's debatable." Mark shrugged. "Still, there's something off about this little guy. Even if it didn't talk, you can't deny it's not normal." Emily nodded, glancing at the sleeping pup again. The unease was still there, but so was something else. Something that felt dangerously close to protectiveness. A knock at the clinic door pulled her attention away. Mark sighed, heading to answer it. Moments later, he returned with a familiar figure trailing behind him, Dr. Richard Hale, a local wildlife biologist. Emily straightened. "You called him?" Mark gave her a look. "I figured an expert opinion wouldn't hurt." Dr. Hale approached the exam table, his sharp eyes scanning the pup. He was in his 60s, with graying hair and a quiet but commanding presence. He didn't speak right away. instead kneeling beside the table to observe the little creature closely. "Where did you find it?" he finally asked. Emily explained, describing how she had discovered the pup alone in the rain. Dr. Hale listened carefully, nodding occasionally, but keeping his thoughts to himself. When she finished, he reached out, running a gentle hand along the pup's back. "It's not a wolf," he said finally. Emily and Mark exchanged glances. "Are you sure?" Emily asked. Hale nodded. "Its bone structure is different. The snout, the ears, similar but not quite right. And this coat," he trailed off, running his fingers through the fur. "It's almost luminescent under the right light. I've only seen this kind of sheen in certain Arctic species." "But that doesn't make sense," Mark interjected. "We're nowhere near the Arctic." Hale nodded. "Exactly." Emily swallowed. "So what is it?" Hale sat back, exhaling slowly. "I don't know. It's something different." The word sent a fresh wave of apprehension through Emily. Something different. Not wild, not domestic. Something in between. The pup stirred again, shifting slightly. Then, slowly, its golden eyes blinked open, locking onto Hale with an unsettling intensity. Hale held its gaze for a long moment before speaking again, quieter this time. "You should be careful with this one." Emily's grip on the coffee cup tightened. "Why?" Hale hesitated. "Animals like this don't just appear out of nowhere. There's a reason it was abandoned." A chill ran through the room, despite the warmth of the clinic. The pup let out a soft sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a whimper, before closing its eyes again. Emily looked down at the small creature curled against the blanket. "I don't care why it was abandoned," she said finally. "I just want to make sure it's safe." Hale studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Then I hope you're ready for whatever comes next." Emily sat in her office long after Dr. Hale left, the weight of his words settling deep in her mind. The pup remained curled up on the examination table, its breathing slow and steady. Despite its peaceful appearance, something about it kept Emily on edge. Not in fear, but in the quiet anticipation of something she didn't quite understand yet. Mark tapped his fingers against the counter, his brows furrowed. "So, what do we do now?" Emily exhaled. "For now, we keep taking care of it. I'll send the DNA sample out today. Hopefully we'll get some answers soon." Mark gave a slow nod. "And if it's not something we can explain?" Emily hesitated before answering. "Then we figure it out as we go." The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine. Patients came and went, their owners chatting about the storm from the previous night, completely unaware of the quiet mystery unfolding in the back room. Emily kept an eye on the pup between appointments, watching for any signs of distress. But it continued to rest, as if the warmth and safety of the clinic were finally allowing it to recover from whatever ordeal it had been through. By evening, the clinic was empty except for Emily and Mark. The pup had finally eaten a small amount, lapping up formula from a shallow dish. Its strength was returning, bit by bit. But with that strength came a growing sense of awareness. Emily noticed it first when she walked into the back room to check on it. The moment she entered, its golden eyes snapped to her, watching her every movement. There was something unnervingly human about the way it studied her, like it was trying to understand her rather than simply react to her presence. She crouched next to the table. "Hey there, little one." The pup didn't flinch or shy away. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if considering her words. Emily swallowed. That wasn't normal puppy behavior. Mark entered behind her. "Okay, tell me I'm not crazy, but that thing is staring into my soul." Emily huffed a quiet laugh, though she couldn't disagree. "It's different." Mark leaned against the counter. "What if it's some kind of experiment? Like, I don't know, a hybrid or something?" Emily ran a hand through her hair. "I don't think anyone around here has the resources for that." Mark shrugged. "Still, it just feels off." Emily couldn't argue with that either. That night, she took the pup home. It didn't seem right to leave it alone in the clinic, and besides, she wanted to observe it more closely. She set up a small crate near the couch, layering it with soft blankets. The pup curled up immediately, but its golden eyes never left her as she moved around the room. She sat on the couch, watching it in return. "You're a mystery, aren't you?" The pup let out a quiet sound, something between a sigh and a whimper. Emily felt something tighten in her chest. She had worked with animals her entire life, but she had never felt a connection quite like this before. There was something almost knowing in the way the pup looked at her. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and she fell asleep with the soft sound of rain pattering against the windows. She woke to an odd sensation. It took her a moment to register that something was different. Then she realized the pup wasn't in the crate anymore. Heart pounding, she sat up quickly, scanning the room. The crate door was still closed. But the pup, it was sitting just a few feet away, staring at her. Her breath caught. "How did you—" The pup stood, its tiny body poised in a way that seemed too deliberate for a normal animal. Then, with slow steps, it padded toward her. When it reached the couch, it placed a small paw on her leg and let out a sound so soft, so distinct, that it sent a shiver down her spine. "Home." Emily froze. The word was barely there, more of a whisper than a fully formed sound. But she had heard it. She was sure of it this time. The pup stared up at her, waiting. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. She swallowed, reaching out slowly. Her fingers brushed against the pup's fur, warm and impossibly soft. It didn't flinch. If anything, it leaned into her touch. Her mind raced. This wasn't possible. Dogs didn't talk. Animals didn't talk. And yet, the pup let out another tiny sound, something between a sigh and another word she couldn't quite make out. But it didn't need to speak clearly for Emily to understand. Something was happening. Something she couldn't explain. And for the first time since she found the pup in the rain, Emily wasn't sure if she was ready to find out the truth. Emily sat completely still, her breath shallow as she stared at the small creature in front of her. The word, or what had sounded like a word, still echoed in her mind. Home. It was impossible, ridiculous even, but she knew she hadn't imagined it. The pup's golden eyes locked onto hers, unblinking, filled with something beyond understanding. Her rational mind fought to explain it. Maybe it was just a trick of the ears, a coincidence. Maybe the pup's whimper happened to sound like a word in her exhausted state. But even as she tried to convince herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was something else entirely. Slowly, she reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled up a search engine. Talking animals, vocalizing puppies, mimicry in dogs. Each result was less satisfying than the last. The explanations were basic. Dogs could sometimes mimic human speech through conditioning. Parrots and some mammals had limited capability for learned words. But nothing she read made sense in the context of what she had just heard. The pup sat watching her, tail flicking slightly, almost like it was waiting. "You didn't just say that, did you?" she murmured, feeling absurd even as the words left her lips. The pup didn't answer. Of course it didn't. She let out a breath, rubbing her temples. "I'm losing my mind." Pushing herself off the couch, she moved toward the kitchen, needing a moment to clear her head. She grabbed a glass and filled it with water, taking a slow sip. When she turned back, the pup had shifted again. It was closer now, no longer on the floor but perched carefully on the couch where she had been sitting. Emily's pulse quickened. She hadn't heard it move. The air in the room felt heavier somehow, charged with something she couldn't name. Mark's words from earlier echoed in her mind. What if it's some kind of experiment, like a hybrid or something? The thought felt absurd, but then again so did everything else. She carefully set her glass down and knelt in front of the couch. "Where did you come from?" she asked softly. The pup cocked its head slightly, then let out a tiny breath, a sound that almost mimicked a sigh. Emily reached out, pressing a hand lightly to its fur. The warmth beneath her fingertips was reassuring. Real. The pup blinked, then nuzzled slightly into her palm. "I don't know what you are," she admitted, more to herself than to the pup. "But we'll figure it out." The moment was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Emily straightened, heart pounding, and glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Who would be visiting this late? She hesitated before moving toward the door. Peering through the peephole, she frowned. A man stood outside, his face partially obscured by the porch light's glow. He was dressed casually. Jeans, a jacket, nothing immediately threatening, but something about him put her on edge. Taking a steadying breath, she unlocked the door and opened it just enough to see him clearly. "Can I help you?" The man's gaze flicked past her, scanning the room behind her before settling back on her face. "Dr. Carter?" Emily's fingers tightened on the door. "Who's asking?" He hesitated for a beat. "My name is David Reynolds. I work with a special division of wildlife services." Emily's stomach tightened. "Wildlife services?" His lips pressed together, as if choosing his words carefully. "We've been tracking reports of an unusual animal in this area. I was wondering if you'd seen anything strange." Emily swallowed. The pup remained silent behind her, but she could feel its presence, its eyes on the back of her head. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said evenly. Reynolds studied her for a moment. "Are you sure? Some of the descriptions we've received suggest a canine that doesn't fit any known species." Emily forced herself to hold his gaze. "I see a lot of animals. I'm a vet." Reynolds nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "If you do happen to come across anything unusual, I'd appreciate a call." He pulled a card from his pocket and handed it to her. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing against the thick paper. The card was simple, just his name and a number. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, keeping her tone neutral. He held her gaze a moment longer before nodding. "Good night, Dr. Carter." She watched as he turned and walked toward a black SUV parked at the curb. He didn't look back as he got in and drove away. Emily closed the door and exhaled sharply. Her hands were shaking. Turning back toward the living room, her eyes landed on the pup, now sitting upright on the couch. Its golden eyes met hers, filled with an intelligence she didn't want to acknowledge. "What are you?" she whispered. The pup didn't answer, but somehow Emily felt like it understood her just the same. Emily stood in the dimly lit living room, her pulse still uneven from the encounter at the door. The card in her hand felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried more weight than just a name and number. She flipped it between her fingers, her mind racing with possibilities. Behind her, the pup remained perched on the couch, watching her closely. Its golden eyes were filled with something Emily couldn't quite name: curiosity, understanding, maybe even concern. The rational part of her mind fought against it, but deep down she felt like it knew exactly what had just happened. She sighed and set the card on the coffee table before rubbing her face with both hands. "What am I supposed to do with you?" she muttered. The pup let out a soft huff, stretching its tiny legs before settling down on the couch. Emily sat beside it, resting her elbows on her knees. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking the quiet. She glanced at the screen. Mark. She hesitated for a second before answering. "Hey," she said, her voice lower than usual. "You okay?" Mark's voice was laced with concern. "I was thinking about what Hale said earlier, and I don't know, something's been bugging me." Emily's gaze flickered to the pup. "Yeah?" Mark sighed on the other end. "I did some digging. There have been reports in other states of unidentified canine species popping up. Some wildlife services offices have records of tracking unusual creatures, but they always disappear before anyone can really study them. Nothing official, though. Just whispers." Emily frowned. "That guy who showed up at my door just now, Reynolds, he said he worked for a special division of wildlife services. He was asking if I'd seen anything strange." Mark was silent for a moment. "That's not good." "No, it's not," she agreed. "And I lied." "Probably smart," Mark said, "but that also means they might come back." Emily ran a hand through her hair. "I don't know what they want, but I don't trust them." Mark sighed. "You sure about keeping the pup? If they're really looking for it." "I'm not handing it over to them," Emily said quickly. The certainty in her voice surprised even her. "Not until I know what's going on." Mark hesitated, then exhaled. "All right, just be careful." "I will." They hung up, and Emily set her phone down, looking at the pup once more. "Guess we're in this together." The pup blinked, then slowly leaned against her side, its small body warm. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and let her fingers drift through its fur. The night stretched on, quiet, but thick with uncertainty. Emily knew this was only the beginning. Whatever secrets the pup carried, she had a feeling she was about to find out, and she wasn't sure she was ready. Emily woke with a start, her body tense before she even knew why. The dim light of early morning filtered through the curtains, casting a faint glow over the living room. She sat up on the couch, rubbing the stiffness from her neck, and then her gaze immediately landed on the pup. It was already awake, sitting on the floor, watching her. Its golden eyes held that same deep intelligence, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that it had been observing her for some time. "Good morning," she murmured, running a hand through her hair. The pup didn't respond, of course, but it tilted its head slightly, as if acknowledging her words. She stood and stretched before heading to the kitchen to start some coffee. The events of the night before replayed in her mind. The visit from Reynolds, Mark's warning, the undeniable sensation that something bigger was happening. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever this pup was, it wasn't normal. As the coffee machine hummed, she leaned against the counter and sighed. She needed a plan. Keeping the pup here indefinitely wasn't an option, not with Reynolds sniffing around. But she wasn't about to turn it over to a group that wouldn't even tell her who they really worked for. A quiet shuffle behind her made her turn. The pup had padded into the kitchen, its small paws nearly silent against the floor. It sat by her feet, looking up at her with an expectant expression. Emily crouched down. "You hungry?" The pup blinked once. Emily took that as a yes. She set out a dish of softened kibble, the same formula she'd been feeding it the day before. The pup sniffed it before beginning to eat, though it did so carefully, almost methodically. Emily watched in fascination. There was something deliberate about the way it moved, as if it were conscious of its every action. As she sipped her coffee, her mind wandered to the DNA test she had sent out. She needed those results. Maybe they would give her a starting point, a way to understand what she was dealing with. A knock at the door shattered her thoughts. Her grip on the mug tightened. She set it down, exhaling slowly before moving toward the door. Peering through the peephole, she saw Mark standing there, looking more awake than she felt. She unlocked the door and let him in. "You're up early." "So are you," Mark pointed out, stepping inside and glancing around. "You sleep at all?" "Barely." His gaze landed on the pup, who was still eating, though it lifted its head briefly to assess him. "It looks better." "Yeah. Eating well? Sleeping through the night?" Emily hesitated. "But there's something off. I don't know how to explain it." Mark crossed his arms. "You mean besides the talking?" Emily rolled her eyes. "It didn't talk." Mark smirked. "Sure." She ignored him and leaned against the counter. "Reynolds came by last night." Mark's smirk vanished. "What?" Emily nodded. "He was asking if I'd seen anything strange. Said he was with a special division of wildlife services." Mark frowned. "That's not good." "No, it's not," she agreed. "I didn't tell him anything, but I think he knows I'm hiding something." Mark ran a hand through his hair. "Emily, we can't just sit on this. If they're really looking for that pup, we need to know why." "I sent out a DNA test," she said. "Once we have the results, we might have a better idea." Mark nodded, but his expression remained tense. "And in the meantime?" Emily looked down at the pup, who was now sitting quietly, watching them both. "We keep it safe." The rest of the morning passed in uneasy silence. Mark stayed for a while, going over possible options, but they both knew they were working with too little information. They needed answers. By the afternoon, Emily received an email. Her heart skipped as she saw the subject line. "DNA results. Urgent." She opened it, scanning the contents quickly. The results were incomplete. The database had flagged the sample as unusual. Too many genetic anomalies. Too many markers that didn't match any known species. The closest match was a wolf hybrid, but even that was inconsistent. Emily's hands clenched around the phone. Mark leaned over. "What does it say?" She shook her head. "They don't know what it is." Silence stretched between them. Mark let out a breath. "Well, that's unsettling." Emily nodded, her gaze drifting to the pup once more. It met her eyes, unblinking, almost as if it already knew. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she set her phone down. The DNA results left her with more questions than answers, and she could feel the tension in the room thickening. The pup was still sitting on the floor, watching her with those golden eyes that seemed far too intelligent. Mark was the first to speak. "So, they don't know what it is?" Emily shook her head. "No, or at least they won't say. It's like the results don't match anything in their database." Mark let out a slow breath. "That's unsettling." She nodded, gripping the edge of the counter. "Which means we have something here that even experts can't identify. And that also means Reynolds and whoever he works for might know more than they're letting on." Mark ran a hand through his hair. "So what do we do now?" Emily hesitated. She had been asking herself the same thing over and over, but the truth was, she didn't have a real answer. All she knew was that she couldn't just hand over the pup to someone she didn't trust. We keep it safe, she said finally. At least until we know more. Mark frowned. Emily, this is getting bigger than you. If they come back, I know, she swallowed. But I can't just turn it over to them, not until I know what they want with it. Mark sighed, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned to the pup. Well, little guy, looks like you're staying put for now. The pup blinked slowly, its small body perfectly still. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that it understood every word. The rest of the afternoon passed in tense silence. Emily tried to distract herself with work, but her thoughts kept circling back to the DNA results and the implications behind them. She kept checking the windows, half expecting Reynolds or someone else to appear. As evening fell, she locked all the doors and sat down on the couch, exhausted. The pup had curled up beside her, its tiny body warm against her leg. She hesitated before running a hand through its fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of its breath. You really are a mystery, she murmured. The pup let out a quiet sigh, almost as if agreeing. A sudden knock at the door made her freeze. Mark tensed beside her. You expecting someone? No. She stood slowly, her heart pounding, and moved toward the door. Peering through the peephole, she expected to see Reynolds again. But it wasn't him. A woman stood outside, her posture rigid, her face partially obscured by the dim light. Emily hesitated before unlocking the door and opening it just a crack. Can I help you? She asked cautiously. The woman's gaze flickered past Emily, scanning the room before settling back on her. Dr. Carter? Emily nodded. Who are you? The woman exhaled sharply. My name is Lillian Hart. I need to talk to you about the pup. Emily's grip on the door tightened. Who are you with? No one, Lillian said quickly. But I know what you have, and I know you're in danger. Emily's stomach twisted. You need to leave. Lillian took a step closer, lowering her voice. You don't understand. That pup, it's not just an animal, and if Reynolds is involved, you're in more trouble than you think. Mark stepped forward. How do you know about Reynolds? Lillian's expression darkened. Because I used to work with him. Silence filled the space between them. Emily's pulse was racing. Prove it. Lillian pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket and handed it to Emily. Hesitant, she took it and unfolded it. It was a photograph. A grainy black and white image of a small pup, almost identical to the one in her living room. Emily's breath caught. What is this? Lillian's voice was grim. It's from 5 years ago, and it's not the only one. Emily looked up sharply. What do you mean? Lillian hesitated, then said, That pup is part of something much bigger, and if you don't want to end up like the others, you need to come with me. Now! Emily's fingers tightened around the photograph as she studied it again. The pup in the picture was nearly identical to the one curled up behind her, the same luminous fur, the same piercing golden eyes. The only difference was the setting. The grainy backdrop suggested a clinical, sterile environment, nothing like the warm space of her home. Her stomach knotted. Where was this taken? Lillian's expression didn't change. A research facility. Off the books. It doesn't exist on any records, but I used to work there. Emily exhaled sharply. And you're telling me this why? Lillian glanced past her toward the living room, her voice lowering. Because I made a mistake before. I won't let it happen again. That pup isn't normal, and Reynolds knows it. He's been tracking anomalies like this for years. If he thinks you have one, he won't stop until he gets it. Mark stepped closer, his skepticism evident. Why should we believe you? You show up out of nowhere with a cryptic warning and expect us to trust you? Lillian met his gaze evenly. I don't expect trust. I expect you to understand the danger you're in. Emily wanted to argue, to push back against the overwhelming uncertainty pressing in on her, but the photograph in her hands made it impossible to ignore. She looked back at the pup, still curled on the couch. Its ears twitched slightly, as if it was listening, understanding. She swallowed. What do they want with it? Lillian hesitated. To study it. To control it. Mark frowned. Control it? It's a puppy. Lillian shook her head. It's not just a puppy. Emily glanced back at the pup again, her mind spinning. Then what is it? Lillian hesitated, then exhaled. We don't know exactly. What we do know is that it's different. It survived things no normal animal should. We've seen them recover from injuries faster than they should. Display intelligence that's beyond what we expect. And then they vanish. Mark crossed his arms. Vanish how? Lillian's jaw tightened. That's the part we don't understand. The ones we tracked, when they reached a certain point, they just disappeared. No bodies, no traces. Just gone. Emily felt a cold wave of unease. She turned to Mark. You saw the DNA results. It doesn't match anything. Mark sighed. I know, but disappearing? That sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. Lillian's gaze was unwavering. You don't have to believe me, but you do have to decide what you're going to do next, because Reynolds won't give up. Emily ran a hand through her hair, frustration mixing with fear. So what do you suggest? We go on the run? Lillian shook her head. Not yet. But you need to be careful. Keep a low profile. Make sure no one else finds out about the pup. And if Reynolds comes back, Mark interrupted. We lie? If you have to, Lillian said simply. Or you leave. Emily's throat tightened. Leave? Lillian nodded. If it comes to that, I can help. Mark let out a dry laugh. You expect us to just pack up our lives and disappear? If it means keeping that pup safe? Yes. Emily looked down at the small creature curled up on the couch. It was sleeping now, breathing evenly, oblivious to the chaos unfolding around it. Or maybe it wasn't oblivious at all. Maybe it knew, in its own strange way, that its presence had changed everything. Emily closed her eyes for a moment before looking back at Lillian. I need time to think. Lillian nodded. I understand, but don't take too long. You might not have that luxury. With that, she turned and walked out the door, leaving Emily and Mark standing in the heavy silence that followed. Mark exhaled, shaking his head. This is insane. Emily nodded absently, her mind still racing. I know. But as she turned back toward the pup, something deep inside her told her that everything Lillian had said was true, and that they were running out of time. Emily sat at her desk, her eyes fixed on the photograph Lillian had left behind. The grainy black and white image seemed to mock her, a reminder of how little she truly understood about the situation she'd found herself in. The pup's uncanny similarity to the creature in the photo left no room for doubt. This wasn't just a stray dog. It was something else entirely. Mark sat on the edge of the couch, his arms crossed tightly. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the soft sound of the pup's breathing as it dozed in a patch of sunlight on the floor. So, what now? Mark asked, his voice low. Emily shook her head slowly. I don't know. Everything Lillian said, it's overwhelming. If she's telling the truth, then we're in way over our heads. Mark ran a hand through his hair. You think she's lying? I don't think so, Emily admitted. There's too much evidence. The DNA test, the photo, the way Reynolds showed up out of nowhere. It all lines up. Then what's our move? Mark pressed. If they're really tracking this pup, if they're willing to go to any lengths to get it, what are we supposed to do? Emily leaned back in her chair, her fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. I need more information. We're working in the dark. If we knew exactly what they wanted, why this pup is so important, we might be able to figure out a plan. Mark hesitated. You're not seriously thinking of meeting with Lillian again, are you? I don't see any other choice, Emily said quietly. She's the only one who seems to know what's going on. If we cut her off now, we lose our best chance at understanding this. Mark frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the idea, but he didn't argue. Instead, he glanced over at the pup, which was now stirring from its nap. It stretched its small legs, yawning softly before blinking up at the two humans. For a moment, it just sat there, its golden eyes filled with an almost unsettling awareness. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Every time she looked into those eyes, she was reminded of just how unusual this little creature was. It was no ordinary pup, not by a long shot. All right, Mark said finally. If you're going to meet with her again, we need to do it on our terms. Somewhere safe, somewhere they can't track us. Emily nodded, already considering the possibilities. I'll set it up, but we have to be careful. No loose ends, no mistakes. Mark didn't respond right away. He seemed to be weighing the risks in his mind. Finally, he said, I'll help you. Whatever you need. Thank you, Emily said, her voice tinged with gratitude. The pup let out a soft sound, almost like a whimper, and moved closer to Emily's feet. She reached down, gently running her hand over its fur. You're a mystery, she whispered, but I'm not giving up on you. The rest of the day passed slowly, tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Emily made careful preparations, choosing a quiet location on the outskirts of town where she could meet Lillian. Mark insisted on coming along, though Emily made it clear that he'd need to keep his distance, just in case. When the time came, Emily slipped the pup into a small carrier and headed out. The drive was tense, every passing car feeling like a potential threat. She couldn't help but glance in her rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see Reynolds' SUV tailing her. But the road remained empty, and eventually she pulled into a secluded parking lot, surrounded by tall trees. Lillian was already there, leaning against the hood of a weathered sedan. She straightened as Emily approached, her expression unreadable. You came, Lillian said simply. Emily stepped out of the car, the carrier in hand. She kept her distance, her body tense. I need more answers. Lillian nodded. I'll tell you what I know, but first, let me see it. Emily hesitated before setting the carrier on the ground and opening the door. The pup stepped out cautiously, its movements deliberate, its gaze locked onto Lillian. The woman knelt down, studying it closely. It's just like the others, Lillian said softly. Same eyes, same coat. It's incredible. Emily crossed her arms. What are they? Lillian rose to her feet. We don't know exactly. We called them anomalies, genetic deviations that shouldn't exist. They're stronger, faster, smarter than any natural canine. We think they were engineered, but no one knows who started it or why. Mark stepped forward from his position near the car. And the disappearing act? What's that about? Lillian glanced at him, her face grim. That's what makes them so dangerous. When they reach a certain age, usually around 1 or 2 years, they start to change. It's like they're evolving. We lost every single one we tracked. They didn't just run away. They vanished. Emily felt a knot of dread in her chest. What happens if we keep it? Lillian's gaze was steady. You'll have a target on your back. Reynolds and his team won't stop. They'll do whatever it takes to get it back. And if we give it to them? Mark asked. They'll keep experimenting, Lillian said simply. And they'll never stop looking for more. Emily looked down at the pup, which had stayed close to her side, its small frame pressed against her leg. The thought of handing it over to people who saw it as nothing more than a test subject made her stomach turn. I can't do that, she said firmly. I won't. Lillian's expression softened slightly. Then you need to be prepared. This won't be easy. Mark placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. We'll figure it out. We'll protect it. Emily nodded, determination hardening in her chest. We'll keep it safe, no matter what. Lillian hesitated, then reached into her pocket and handed Emily a slip of paper. If you need to disappear, this will help. Just be careful who you trust. Emily took the paper, her fingers brushing against the edges of what felt like a phone number. She tucked it away and met Lillian's gaze. Thank you. Lillian gave a small nod. Good luck. Without another word, she turned and walked back to her car. Emily watched her go, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. She glanced down at the pup, who looked up at her with those intelligent, golden eyes. We'll keep you safe, she whispered, no matter what it takes. The pup wagged its tail faintly, and for a brief moment, Emily allowed herself to hope that they might actually stand a chance. Emily drove back to her clinic with the pup settled quietly in the passenger seat. She had kept it out of the carrier this time, letting it curl up on the seat beside her, and it hadn't made a sound the entire ride. Her thoughts churned as she navigated the familiar streets, the conversation with Lillian replaying in her mind. If what Lillian said was true, then the pup's existence wasn't just a mystery, it was a threat. And the more Emily thought about it, the more she realized just how unprepared she was to deal with what might come next. When she pulled into the clinic's parking lot, she sat for a moment, her hand still gripping the wheel. The pup looked up at her, its golden eyes meeting hers. It didn't seem afraid. If anything, it seemed calm, as if it trusted her completely. Emily envied its certainty. She picked it up and carried it inside, locking the door behind her. The clinic was quiet, dimly lit by the glow of the reception desk's lamp. She set the pup down on a cushioned chair and went to make herself a cup of coffee. The warmth of the mug in her hands grounded her slightly, though it did little to ease the tension in her chest. Mark arrived not long after, letting himself in with his spare key. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. Emily nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was being honest. "I'm fine. Just trying to figure out what to do next." Mark glanced at the pup, which was watching them quietly from its spot on the chair. "It still doesn't seem dangerous." "I don't think it's dangerous," Emily said. "But if Lillian's right, it's not just some stray animal either, and that means Reynolds isn't going to stop looking." Mark rubbed the back of his neck. "What about that number she gave you? Are you planning on calling it?" Emily hesitated. "Not yet. I don't even know what I'd say. Hi, I have a genetically engineered mystery pup that a shadowy government agency wants to take from me. Any advice?" Mark gave her a half smile. "Yeah, probably not the best opening line." They sat in silence for a moment before Mark said, "We could always try going off the grid for a while. Lay low, see if they lose interest." Emily shook her head. "If Reynolds is as determined as Lillian says, he'll find us eventually. I think the only way to protect the pup is to figure out what makes it so valuable. If we understand that, we might have leverage." Mark looked skeptical. "You think they'll just back off if we figure out what it is?" "No," Emily admitted. "But we might have a better chance of outmaneuvering them if we know what we're dealing with." Mark sighed. "All right, so what's the plan?" "I'm not sure yet," Emily said honestly. "But I know we can't do this alone. I might need to reach out to someone who can help us get answers." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You mean a scientist? A researcher?" "Maybe," Emily said, "but someone we can trust. Someone who won't just hand us over to Reynolds." Mark nodded slowly. "Okay, let's start with that. But Emily..." "Yeah?" He hesitated. "Be careful who you trust. Even if they seem legit, we don't know who might be connected to Reynolds or whoever else is behind this." Emily gave him a faint smile. "You don't have to tell me twice." They spent the rest of the evening brainstorming, going over possible contacts and trying to piece together what little information they had. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As the night wore on, Emily found herself looking at the pup more and more. It was calm, almost eerily so, and seemed completely unfazed by the tension surrounding it. She couldn't help but wonder if it truly understood what was happening. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and rubbed her eyes. "We need to get some rest. We're not going to figure this out tonight." Mark nodded. "Yeah, you're probably right." They decided to stay at the clinic for the night, taking turns keeping watch. Emily set up a small bed for the pup in the corner of the room, but as soon as she turned away, it climbed back onto the chair where it had been sitting before. She didn't have the heart to move it again. As she lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something much bigger than they'd anticipated. The pup's steady breathing was a small comfort in the darkness, but it wasn't enough to drown out the unease that had settled in her chest. She closed her eyes, trying to focus on the immediate task at hand, finding someone they could trust, someone who could help them understand what this pup was and why it was so important. And most importantly, someone who could help them stay one step ahead of Reynolds and whatever shadowy organization he represented. For now, that was all they could do. Keep moving forward, one step at a time, until they uncovered the truth. Emily woke to the faint sound of footsteps and the rustle of paper. Her eyes opened slowly, the soft glow of the clinic's emergency lights casting long shadows across the room. She sat up, her neck stiff from sleeping on the couch, and glanced toward the reception desk. Mark was there, hunched over, flipping through a stack of old files. She pushed the blanket off and got to her feet. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, her voice hushed. Mark looked up, startled for a moment, then relaxed. "Not really. Thought I'd see if we had anything here that might help." Emily stepped closer, peering at the yellowed pages in his hands. "What are you looking for?" "Anything unusual," Mark said. "Old case records, notes from before you took over the clinic. Maybe something similar happened before." Emily frowned. "You think there might be a pattern?" "I don't know," Mark admitted. "But it's worth checking, isn't it?" She nodded slowly. "Yeah, it is." They worked together in silence, sifting through files that hadn't been touched in years. Most were routine: spay and neuter surgeries, vaccinations, the occasional emergency procedure for a pet that had swallowed something it shouldn't have. But as they went deeper into the stacks, the cases started to blur together, the same patterns repeating over and over. Until Mark froze, his fingers gripping a file folder tightly. "Emily," he said, his voice low. She looked over. "What is it?" Mark held up the folder. "This. Look at the date." She took the folder from him, her eyes scanning the label. The date was from 10 years ago, well before she'd taken over the clinic. Inside were handwritten notes, faded photographs, and a series of lab results that had been printed on an old dot matrix printer. "What am I looking at?" Emily asked, her brow furrowing as she flipped through the pages. "Read the notes," Mark said. "Look at the description." She scanned the handwritten lines, the faint smell of old paper wafting up as she turned the pages. The notes described an animal that had been brought in late one night by a local farmer. The farmer claimed to have found it wandering near the edge of his property. It was described as a pup, but with features that didn't quite match any known breed. Its coat was silver, its eyes a striking gold. The farmer had thought it was a wolf, but the notes suggested otherwise. Emily's pulse quickened. This sounds just like—" "Exactly," Mark said. "It sounds like the same thing." She continued reading. The notes mentioned that the pup had been kept at the clinic for observation, but after a few days, it had disappeared without a trace. No sign of how it had gotten out, no evidence left behind. Just gone. Emily stared at the pages in disbelief. "I had no idea this had happened here." "Neither did I," Mark said. "But it's not just some random coincidence. There's a pattern here." Emily set the file down, her mind racing. If this had happened before, then it wasn't just about the pup they had now. This was something larger, something that had been going on for years. "We need to find out who wrote these notes," she said. "And if they know anything else." Mark nodded. "Agreed. But it's late. Let's get a few hours of sleep and start fresh in the morning." Emily wanted to keep going, to dig deeper into the files and piece together the puzzle. But she knew Mark was right. They needed rest. Reluctantly, she closed the folder and set it aside, her mind still buzzing with questions as she lay back down on the couch. The pup remained curled up in its makeshift bed, its breathing slow and steady. Emily watched it for a moment, her hand resting lightly on its side. Whatever this little creature was, it had changed everything, and she had a feeling the answers they were searching for were closer than ever. The morning came with a heavy fog outside the clinic's windows, blurring the edges of the world. Emily rubbed her eyes and sat up, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Mark was already awake, sipping from a mug of coffee and scrolling through his phone. The files they had combed through the previous night were neatly stacked on the desk. "Any news?" Emily asked. Mark shook his head. "Nothing yet. But I was thinking, whoever wrote those notes might still be in the area. Maybe someone who used to work here, or the farmer who brought the pup in." Emily frowned. If it was that long ago, they might have moved away, or retired. "Still worth a try," Mark said. "I'll start asking around, see if anyone remembers them." She nodded, though the thought of digging into something this murky made her uneasy. The last thing she wanted was to attract more attention from Reynolds or anyone else connected to the original experiments. But she knew they couldn't afford to sit idle. "I'll stay here with the pup," Emily said. "Keep an eye on things, and see if I can find more clues in these files." Mark agreed, and left a short while later, leaving Emily alone in the quiet clinic. The pup was awake now, padding around the room with a curious air. It sniffed at the stack of files on the desk, then looked up at Emily as if waiting for her to do something. She leaned down and stroked its head. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" The pup didn't respond, of course, but its gaze held steady, golden eyes meeting hers with a calm intensity. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that it understood more than a typical animal should. And if it truly was like the one described in the old notes, then it might hold the key to unraveling the mystery. As the hours passed, Emily immersed herself in the files. She found more scattered mentions of unusual cases, though none as detailed as the one from 10 years ago. There were brief notes about animals that had been brought in with strange injuries that healed too quickly, or creatures that displayed unusual behaviors before disappearing without a trace. The cases were rare, spread out over years, but they all pointed to something extraordinary happening right under everyone's noses. Emily took careful notes, cross-referencing dates and locations. She began to notice a pattern. Most of the anomalies seemed to appear near the same area where the farmer had found the pup a decade earlier. A remote stretch of woods that bordered a long abandoned industrial site. The more she dug, the more convinced she became that the answers lay there. When Mark returned that evening, he brought news. "I found someone who used to work here," he said. "An old vet tech named Ruth. She remembered the case." Emily's eyes widened. "What did she say?" Mark sat down, his expression serious. "She said she never saw anything like it before or since. She told me the pup acted strange, smarter than it should have been, and then it just disappeared. She thought someone must have broken in and taken it, but there was no sign of forced entry." Emily's stomach tightened. "Did she say anything about the farmer who brought it in?" Mark nodded. She remembered him too. His name was Frank Jensen. He owned a small property on the edge of the woods. Ruth said he was a quiet guy, didn't come into town much. But after he brought in that pup, he stopped showing up altogether. No one's seen him in years. Emily leaned back, her mind racing. If we can find that property, maybe we can figure out what happened to him. And maybe we can find more answers about where these pups are coming from. Mark hesitated. "If it's been abandoned for that long, it might be dangerous." "I know," Emily said. "But it's our only lead." They spent the next few hours gathering supplies and planning their approach. By the time they were ready to leave, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clinic's parking lot. Emily secured the pup in its carrier, though it didn't seem frightened, just curious. Mark drove, the winding roads becoming narrower and more overgrown the closer they got to the property. When they finally arrived, the house was barely visible through the thick trees. It was a small, weathered building with boarded-up windows and a sagging porch. The surrounding land was wild, nature reclaiming the space. They stepped out of the car and approached cautiously. Emily held a flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. "Stay close," Mark said, his voice low. Emily nodded, her heart pounding. She reached for the door, but it creaked open at her touch. The inside was dark and musty, the faint outline of furniture barely visible. They moved carefully, the flashlight revealing a cluttered living room that looked like it had been left in a hurry. As they explored, they found scattered papers, old photographs, and a few faded notes. Most were mundane, shopping lists, letters, but one note caught Emily's attention. It was a short, handwritten entry dated around the same time as the vet's records. It mentioned finding something unusual in the woods and needing to report it to someone named Hale. "Hale," Emily murmured. "That name sounds familiar." Mark frowned. "Could it be someone who worked at the clinic back then?" "Maybe," Emily said, "or someone connected to these experiments. We need to find out who Hale is." They continued searching, but as the night deepened, the sense of unease grew. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though she saw no signs of anyone else. The pup remained quiet in its carrier, its golden eyes scanning the room as if it, too, sensed something. When they finally left the house, Emily felt no closer to understanding the full scope of what they were dealing with. But she knew one thing for certain. Whoever this Hale was, he might be the key to unlocking the truth. And they would have to find him before it was too late. Emily woke up to an unusually calm morning. The faint hum of a world that hadn't quite started moving yet carried through the air as she stretched out on the couch, trying to shake off the heaviness of her dreams. The clinic felt strangely peaceful, almost too quiet given the weight of everything that had happened. The pup stirred from its spot near the desk, letting out a soft yawn before padding over to Emily's side. Its golden eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, all the chaos of the past days seemed to fade. But Emily knew it was only temporary. The questions, the dangers, they were still there, lurking just beyond the clinic walls. Mark was already awake, sipping his coffee and scrolling through his phone. He glanced over as she sat up. "Morning." "Morning," she replied. "Anything new?" "Not yet," he said. "I checked the news, but there's nothing about Reynolds or anything else that might connect to, you know." Emily nodded, rubbing her temples. "We need to figure out what to do next. We can't just sit here waiting for them to show up." Mark set his cup down. "You're right. But we need to be smart about it. If we go digging too hard, we might draw more attention." "Then we dig carefully," Emily said. "We start by finding this Hale person. If they're connected to what happened before, they might have answers." Mark agreed, and the two of them spent the morning researching. Emily went through more of the old clinic files, searching for any mention of Hale, while Mark worked his connections in town. By the time the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, they had pieced together a possible lead. A retired researcher named Dr. Victor Hale, who had once worked at a nearby wildlife conservation center. He was known for studying genetic anomalies in animals, but his work had been shrouded in controversy before he suddenly left the field about a decade ago. "This has to be the guy," Emily said, pointing to a faded newspaper article she had found. The headline read, "Local Scientists' Research Under Scrutiny." Mark leaned over to read the article. Looks like he was studying rare genetic markers in wildlife. Some kind of cutting-edge genetics, but it doesn't say why he stopped. "Whatever happened, it must have been bad enough to make him disappear," Emily said. "But if he's still in the area, he might know what we're dealing with." They tracked down a possible address, an old farmhouse on the edge of town. It was a long shot, but they had no other leads. By late afternoon, they were back in the car, driving down a winding dirt road that led to a secluded property surrounded by dense trees. The house came into view, a weathered structure that had clearly seen better days. A few chickens roamed the yard, and a rusted pickup truck was parked near the porch. Emily stepped out of the car first, her heart pounding. She approached the front door and knocked, the sound echoing through the quiet surroundings. Mark stood behind her, his posture tense, as if ready for anything. After a few moments, the door creaked open slightly, revealing an older man with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. His white hair was cropped close, and his weathered face suggested a life spent outdoors. He looked at Emily and Mark with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "Dr. Hale?" Emily asked, her voice steady despite her nerves. The man didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted to the pup, which was peeking out from behind Emily's legs. His eyes narrowed slightly before he finally spoke. "Who are you?" "My name is Emily Carter," she said. "I'm a veterinarian in town. This is my friend Mark." Hale's expression didn't change. "Why are you here?" "We need your help," Emily said. "We've come across something unusual, and we think you might know what it is." Hale's eyes flicked back to the pup. You brought it here? Emily hesitated, then nodded. Yes. I found it during the storm a few days ago. Since then, people have been trying to take it. We don't know what it is, but we know it's not just a normal animal. Hale stepped back, opening the door wider. Come in, quickly. Emily and Mark exchanged a glance before following him inside. The house was cluttered, but cozy, filled with books, old research papers, and photographs of wildlife. Hale led them to a small sitting area and gestured for them to take a seat. What do you know about that pup? Hale asked, his voice low. Not much, Emily admitted. We ran a DNA test, but the results didn't match anything in the database. It's different. Hale nodded slowly. It's not just different. It's engineered. Emily's stomach dropped. What do you mean? Hale leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. Years ago, I was part of a team studying genetic anomalies in wildlife. At first, we thought we were simply cataloging rare mutations. But the more we looked, the more we realized something was off. These weren't natural mutations. They were too precise, too deliberate. Mark frowned. You're saying someone created these animals? Hale nodded. Yes. I don't know who or why, but we started finding animals that shouldn't exist. Creatures that could heal faster, adapt quicker, even understand more than they should. That pup you brought in, it's one of them. And if someone's still looking for it, they're not going to stop. Emily felt a chill run through her. Why would anyone create something like this? Hale shook his head. I never found out. All I know is that the project I was part of fell apart when we got too close to the truth. People disappeared, funding vanished, and I was left holding the pieces. I walked away, thinking it was over. But if you've found that pup, it means it's not over. Mark leaned forward. Do you know who's behind it? The name Reynolds keeps coming up. Hale's expression darkened. Reynolds. I remember him. He was one of the field agents who brought in samples. He worked for a division that didn't officially exist. If he's still involved, then it means whoever was behind this is still pulling the strings. Emily's mind raced. What do we do? Hale was silent for a moment before answering. You need to keep that pup safe. Don't let it out of your sight. And if Reynolds shows up again, you have to be ready to run. There are people out there who will stop at nothing to get their hands on it. Mark exhaled sharply. This just keeps getting worse. Emily nodded, her determination hardening. We'll do whatever it takes. We won't let them take it. Hale gave her a long, measured look. You've got courage. You're going to need it. The rest of the conversation was a blur. Hale gave them as much information as he could remember. Old names, locations, bits and pieces of a puzzle that still felt incomplete. When they finally left the farmhouse, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road. Back at the clinic, Emily and Mark sat in silence, the weight of everything they had learned pressing down on them. The pup was asleep on the floor, its small body curled up in a tight ball. Emily watched it for a long moment before speaking. We're not just protecting it, she said softly. We're fighting for it. Mark nodded. Then we fight. Whatever it takes.